Will there be two Dalai Lamas inside the clash between China and Gaden? Phodrang Trust. As the 14th Dalai Lama turns 90 this week on July 6, the quiet monastery town of Dharamshala is again at the center of a global debate. The issue this time goes beyond religion. It's about who gets to decide the spiritual future of Tibet, and more importantly, who gets to control it. At the heart of this succession struggle is the Gaden Phodrang Trust, the only institution authorized by the Dalai Lama to recognize his future reincarnation. China has made no secret of its intention to identify its own Dalai Lama candidate, using state-controlled religious channels. While it has never appointed a Dalai Lama before, Beijing has repeatedly signaled, particularly through a 2007 regulation, that it intends to name its own successor after the 14th Dalai Lama passes. The Gaden Phodrang, however, asserts exclusive spiritual and historical legitimacy in the succession process. As both sides prepare to assert their claims, the role of the Gaden Phodrang Trust, and why it remains central to the search for the next Dalai Lama has come into sharp focus. Nanan. The Gaden Phodrang was originally the name of the government established by the 5th Dalai Lama in the 17th century. It was both the spiritual and temporal authority in Tibet, ruling from the Potala Palace in Lhasa. For centuries, this institution was central to Tibetan governance, combining monastic leadership with political power. After the Chinese annexation of Tibet in 1950 and the subsequent flight of the 14th Dalai Lama to India in 1959, the Gaden Phodrang was re-established in exile. Over time, its role evolved. In 2011, the Dalai Lama gave up all political authority, passing it to the democratically elected Central Tibetan Administration. The Gaden Phodrang remained his personal spiritual office, which he then formalized as a non-profit trust to carry forward his religious legacy. Since then, the Gaden Phodrang Trust has served as the spiritual and institutional body overseeing matters relating to the Dalai Lama's lineage, teachings, and reincarnation. Nanan. The current Dalai Lama has repeatedly emphasized that only the Gaden Phodrang Trust can carry out the process of identifying his successor. This position has been established through decades of spiritual discourse and policy decisions. Nanis. This exclusive mandate derives from religious tradition, the personal authority of the Dalai Lama, and the institutional continuity of Gaden Phodrang's spiritual role. Nanan. According to Tibetan custom, after a Dalai Lama passes away, senior monks and spiritual advisors consult oracles, observe dreams, and interpret visions. They also look for physical signs and test potential children to see if they recognize sacred items from the previous Dalai Lama's life. It was through this process that the current Dalai Lama was discovered in 1939. A 2-year-old boy in Amdo, northeastern Tibet, identified objects belonging to the 13th Dalai Lama, and was eventually enthroned in 1940. This sacred, non-political process is what the Gaden Phodrang Trust now seeks to preserve. Nanan. The Chinese government has a different vision. Beijing claims the right to manage all religious affairs within its borders, including reincarnations. It bases its claim on a 1793 Qing dynasty edict, which introduced the golden urn system, a robust method to select reincarnated lamas. Though seldom used historically, China now insists it must be the only method allowed. In 2007, the Chinese State Administration for Religious Affairs passed a regulation stating that all reincarnations of Tibetan Buddhist leaders must receive state approval. This legal framework effectively blocks any candidate from being recognized in China without Communist Party approval. The Dalai Lama has explicitly rejected this, stating that his reincarnation will be born in a free country, outside Chinese jurisdiction. Nanan. The Panchen Lama case stands as the clearest precedent for what may unfold again. The Panchen Lama is traditionally the second highest spiritual authority in Tibetan Buddhism, often playing a key role in identifying the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. In 1995, the 14th Dalai Lama identified a 6-year-old boy, Gedhun Choi Kai Numa, as the 11th Panchen Lama. Within days, Chinese authorities abducted the boy and his family. He has not been seen since. In his place, Beijing installed its own Panchen Lama Gyaltsen Norbu, a child loyal to the party's religious apparatus. However, the Chinese appointed figure is widely rejected by the Tibetan exile community and many Buddhists worldwide. He is seen as a political figure lacking spiritual legitimacy. The controversy continues to cast a long shadow, reinforcing why the Gaden Phodrang Trust is determined to safeguard the traditional, monastical process of reincarnation. The fear remains that Beijing will attempt a similar intervention in the case of the Dalai Lama, using state power to impose a successor lacking spiritual legitimacy. Nanan, the Gaden Phodrang Trust is not just a religious entity, it is based in Dharamshala, India, and symbolizes India's moral and spiritual support for the Tibetan cause. For India, the Dalai Lama represents more than a refugee. He is a cultural guest, a Nobel laureate, and a symbol of religious freedom. The succession process, therefore, places India in a diplomatically sensitive spot. If the next Dalai Lama is found within India, it may strain ties with China, but refusing to support the Trust's authority could weaken New Delhi's moral standing. Globally, countries like the United States have already legislated support for the Tibetan-led succession process. The Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2020 authorizes sanctions against any Chinese officials who interfere with the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. The European Parliament and other democratic governments have echoed similar sentiments. Nanan, all signs point to a likely duality in succession. China is expected to appoint its own Dalai Lama through official state institutions, possibly invoking the Golden Anakingara ritual it used in the Panchen Lama case. On the other side, the Gaden Phodrang Trust, following established Tibetan Buddhist procedures, is expected to identify a reincarnation outside Chinese territory, most likely from among exile communities. Swipe left for next video. This would result in two claimants, one endorsed by the Chinese state and the other recognized by the Tibetan religious hierarchy and the global diaspora. The world must now prepare for a religious showdown with geopolitical implications. The question is no longer just who will be the next Dalai Lama, it is also whose Dalai Lama will the world accept. Latest blogs.